Hello everyone, and welcome to this edition of Talk of the Town. I'm James Milan, and we are with a familiar face today. Familiar from the viewers of this show and also to Arlingtonians in general. He is, of course, Sean Garballey, our state representative, who will soon, in fact, be enjoying his 10th anniversary in the State House on our behalf. And we want to express our appreciation for your time today, for your time over the last decade, and for your devotion to the issues that matter to Arlington.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And having gotten that out on the table, and we're sincere about it, we want to dive right in and talk about the issues that are most pertinent right now. Love it if you could start by giving us a sense of the context of where we are in the legislative cycle. We are speaking to you right now in mid-February. So where does that put us on the legislative cycle?
Well, first, James, thank you, and thank ACMi for having me on, as you always do. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to be able to communicate directly with the residents of the town I love so much. So you are correct. We are in the second year of the two-year session in the legislature. And we just passed last week what is known as Joint Rule 10 Day, which is the rule in the legislature which all pieces of legislation that are currently in committee have a deadline of needing to either be reported out favorably, given an extension order until usually March, or sent to study, which basically ends the opportunity for that bill to be passed within this legislative session. Our session is going to last until July 31st of this calendar year. So it seems like a long way off being February, but being in the legislature for a long time, I know that it's going to come up very, very quickly. So we don't have a lot of opportunities to try to get our priorities heard in the body and enough time to get our bills through. So that's what I will be spending my time the next 6 or 7 months, is to really trying to get my priorities through the legislature.
Right, and we are soon to speak about those priorities, no doubt. But let me ask you, you were just mentioning that Joint Rule 10 has just passed, and therefore this whole stage of the committees weighing these bills and then assessing them and giving those assessments is happening now. Does virtually all legislation end up going that same route, having to be examined by the pertinent committee and then being either getting its approval or an extension, as you said?
Yeah, so last year I filed all the bills that I filed around 70 pieces of legislation, and then the clerk takes those bills and, depending on the pertinent subject matter, sends them out to each of the joint committees. And then the committee has a chance to examine each of the pieces of legislation that I filed, and also calls a date for a hearing in which members of the public and other folks, lobbyists, advocates, are allowed to come to that hearing on that particular day and share their support for the bill, concern for the bill, opposition to the bill. And then the committee hears that. They solicit feedback on the legislation in person, as I just said, or in writing. Members of the public can submit written testimony, which I know a lot of people in Arlington do on a whole myriad of matters that are before different committees. And then the committee chairman, along with the vice chairman and members of the joint committee, and a joint committee is comprised of members of the House and members of the Senate, make a determination on the facts of the bill and the priorities of the membership, whether or not to release a bill out favorably, send it to study, or to extend the opportunity for more discussion around a piece of legislation that usually lasts until March.
That makes sense. So we're going to start looking at the issues now, and I'm going to go in no particular order, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
But chronologically speaking, the governor's budget has just recently been released. And I know that you guys would only have had at this point a chance just to get a first impression of it that further diving into it awaits you in future months. But I wanted to get a sense of what your first impression is.
Right. Well, the governor, as you just said, James, just released what is known as House 2, his House 2, and that is his budget that he filed in January, which is the second budget of the legislative calendar year. Last year's budget was known as House 1. This year is House 2, and it really is an outline of the governor, the administration's priorities on a number of issues around transportation, healthcare, and local aid. We have different priorities in the governor in some instances, and that is why his budget really outlines his priorities. And then come April, when we debate the budget as of the House of Representatives, we outline our priorities for the Commonwealth. The Senate will follow suit with their budget debate in May, and then a conference committee comprised of members of the House and the Senate will reach a consensus and send our budget to the governor for his opportunity to examine our priorities and to exercise his line item veto power. And so that is how the budget is done in Massachusetts. So the governor's budget really is just a snapshot of his administration's priorities for the $40 billion budget that happens in the state. I am pleased to report that there is a relatively small increase in local aid, both in Chapter 70 and unrestricted general government aid. Speaking with both Town Manager Adam Chapdelaine and Superintendent of Schools Kathleen Bodie, they were pleased with the governor's numbers, so they have asked me to either hold the line and don't go any lower than what the governor proposed for local aid for Arlington, or to try to go higher. And of course, coming from the Arlington School Committee before I was your state representative, my goal is to always go higher in terms of local aid, Chapter 70, and unrestricted general government aid. One of my top priorities this session in working with members of the school committee and certainly our superintendent of schools is to try to increase the appropriation that we expend for the special education circuit breaker, because that money really is critical for the costs of out-of-district placement for special education costs to the district, and the circuit breaker is really, really important for that, both in this budget that we're going to be debating in April, but also this year we're hoping to do a supplement budget that will make up the gap that was not funded for the special ed circuit breaker last year. So we're hoping that that's going to be direct revenue to help our cities and towns, particularly Arlington.
Fair enough. So you had mentioned that you were, I think you said you were pleasantly surprised, or you were pleased that there was an increase in local aid, modest or however it was. Are you pleased because you were expecting something worse from the governor, or because in general you find that this degree of increase in the state aid is, something that aligns with what you would have been looking for?
Well, I'd like to see a larger increase in local aid. I was pleased to see that the governor's priority was to increase local aid, but like I said, it's really a snapshot. It's really the governor's opportunity to tell the constituents of the Commonwealth, his constituents, the people of Massachusetts and the legislature, in terms of what he is hoping the legislature will deliver on when we deliberate on our budget. So my hope, and as a member of the Joint Committee on Ways and Means, and we are starting our budget deliberations tomorrow when we're in Worcester, and we will be having hearings all across the state to solicit feedback on each particular subject matter within the governor's budget. But my goal really is to increase local aid to Arlington and Medford, and to cities and towns across the Commonwealth. So I was pleased to see that that is what the governor would like to do. I would like to go higher, of course. Arlington needs as much investment from the Commonwealth as possible. but it is good to see the focus of where the governor is. But like I said, the governor's budget, the House 2, is really just a snapshot in terms of outlining the governor's priorities. We as a legislature will have our own priorities.
Right, but is it fair to characterize it as the governor setting a baseline in terms of these local aid numbers, which of course you and other legislators might decide that you want to try and get more for your constituents and constituencies than that. But it's can we assume that it is unlikely that the local aid budget will be any lower than what the governor has already submitted?
Certainly, speaking as one legislator and as a member of the Joint Committee on Ways and Means, my goal is that it is a baseline and that we would not go lower. But as one of 160 members of the House, I can't speak for my colleagues, but I will say local aid investment certainly is a priority for a large amount of legislators in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and certainly on the Joint Committee on Ways and Means. The budget really is a snapshot for how the governor aligns his priorities in the budget, but also around revenue growth. He takes where he believes is responsible spending, where we are in terms of revenue numbers for the Commonwealth, and where he thinks he can expend them. Now, like was said earlier, he did that at the end of January. We don't deliberate the budget until April. So revenue numbers can go up and they can go down. So we'll be watching those numbers very carefully in order for us to draft our budget proposal for the members of the House to deliberate in April. But certainly I would not vote for a budget that lowers the local aid amount lower than what the governor produced in his House 2 budget.
That makes sense. You had already alluded to the fact that Arlington could use as much state aid as we can get. We will certainly, if past records are any indicator, we will use that money responsibly. But an issue that we can't help but hit on each time we talk to you, really, about these kinds of items is Arlington's particular situation. And I'm alluding, of course, or referring, of course, to the fact that we have such a very, very high percentage of our revenues coming from people's property taxes and such a very small percentage from a commercial tax base. Do you have any sense of how the battle, I think, would be not an inappropriate way to put it, against the odds for a town like Arlington to get a little bit more money because of that situation? Do you have any sense of how, whether the prospects are any cheerier than they have ever been before?
Well, certainly, when I'm up at the State House having conversations with colleagues and really trying to work with colleagues on particular matters to Arlington's budget and arguing Arlington's current constraints and situations with the local aid formula, certainly I always argue for Arlington to get a little more, to get what I believe should be our fair share, both in Chapter 70 and in UGA. I think what our priority will be as a legislature right now is to try to implement the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations. So this is separate from UGA, which is the unrestricted general government aid number, and separate from Chapter 70.
Which is educational budget?
Correct. So the Chapter 70 is education, correct. So the Foundation Budget Review Commission was a commission that was put together by a number of legislators. I had sponsored the bill to really study, how much money does it really cost to properly educate a student in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And if the Commonwealth is correctly, responsibly funding that education. And it was found that there was a gap of over $1 billion that the state should be funding more in our students' education across the Commonwealth. Especially when you take into consideration what school committee members call, the unfunded mandates, mandates that the Commonwealth makes school districts do, but they don't necessarily get funding for it. So the Foundation Budget Review Commission did its work. It found out that statistic and made a number of recommendations on funding around health insurance that the state is not properly funding, recommendations around special education that the state is not properly funding, and a whole host of other areas that we're hoping the state can make up that gap. And that's important, James, because that certainly would make our whole budget picture a lot better, because these are costs that the schools are mandated to cover and pick up anyway. So it would be nice if that would be supplementary funding that we could use in other areas to help Chapter 70 and UGA. So I've sat down a few times with the chairwoman of education, Alice Peisch, who's from Wellesley, and her priority and my priority going into our budget deliberation in April is trying to make a significant investment appropriation to the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. Now, I can't give a lot of specifics in terms of what the recommendations will be, because it does depend on the revenue picture between now and April, but we have been seeing our revenue numbers continue to grow. And so my goal will be that we invest in the recommendations specifically around special education, but also healthcare as well, to help the schools deal with that growth and to finally try to close that gap. Now, in terms of a community's inability to grow our tax base, because as you said, James, earlier, Arlington does not have a large commercial tax base. That is something that obviously is absolutely essential. And that is a different conversation than the Foundation Budget Review Commission. That is a question of having a conversation on changing the formulas that contribute to the appropriation that Arlington and other 350 communities in Massachusetts receive in the area of Chapter 70 and unrestricted general government aid. Because we are perceived as a wealthier community, we don't do as well in the formulas as some of our other cities in the Commonwealth, and that negatively impacts us, obviously, because we don't have as large of a commercial tax base as a Waltham or a Burlington or other cities that also have large parcels of land, so they're able to grow their commercial tax base. But we aren't able to do that. So any conversation about changing the formula, and I don't believe it's going to happen this session, but as I have always said to the gentlemen who keep filing these pieces of legislation, needs to take into account a community's inability to grow economically their own tax base. That needs to be in the formula, which would help a community like Arlington. But as I caution local officials, the folks who are pushing for a change in the local aid formula also hail from communities like New Bedford and Fall River and Lowell and Boston, who believe that their constituents aren't receiving enough local aid as well. So we need to be concerned that if there were a change in the Chapter 70 formula and UGA formula, that because it would maybe benefit Fall River and New Bedford students, that it may not necessarily favor Arlington students, and actually we may be at a more disadvantage than our current formula. So it's important to take that into account.
So but things could get worse.
So, well, certainly we don't want them to get worse.
Of course, of course.
But certainly, the state representative from New Bedford isn't, focusing on the people of Arlington in terms of making sure that his students have the necessary revenue to receive their education as possible. So any conversation, it's a conversation that I want to have happen. I've been pushing for a new local aid formula for some time, since I was on the school committee. We need to make sure that that aspect of a community's inability to grow is in the formula itself, which I believe is necessary and would protect Arlington if the formula would change and would actually help Arlington more. Without that, however, without that assurance in any type of question of changing the formula, Arlington would be negatively impacted. So we really need to watch that and focus our attention on that.
Fair enough. Your record over the years shows that you have a number of issues that you hold very, very close to your heart, and have promoted a lot of action on already. One of those is transportation, and specifically the MBTA. So bring us up to date on where things stand with any legislation that you're sponsoring or others that people should be aware of moving forward in terms of the transportation picture more generally, the MBTA specifically.
Well, I appreciate that, James, and obviously that's an extremely important question. Our economy can't function without a 21st century transportation system. And I've always believed, over the past 10 years, legislators have failed the people of Massachusetts in terms of really investing in the MBTA, really investing in a 21st century solution to a statewide transportation solution. One of the reasons I voted against a revenue plan, I think 4 years ago now, was because it only generated about $500 million. And the belief was that this revenue plan, which was an increase in the tobacco tax and a 3-cent increase on the gas tax, was going to fix the MBTA. But what I knew at the time, and one of the reasons I voted against that proposal, is that the revenue was inadequate and that the tax source was regressive. And what we need to do in Massachusetts is give a permanent revenue solution to the MBTA so the MBTA has an adequate revenue source to run our trains, our buses, the ferries, the ride, and the commuter rail, all the aspects of public transportation within that 175 community that are part of the MBTA, but also the regional transit authorities from across the state, making sure we have a 21st century transportation system. So I chair the MBTA caucus, so certainly I file amendments to try to increase that investment. Actually, tomorrow I am having a caucus meeting with the new general manager of the MBTA, Luis Ramirez, to talk with members of the House and the Senate about his plans and his futures for investment in the MBTA and different priorities of his. There is an initiative that is going to go before the voters in November, known as the Fair Share Amendment. That's also known as the Millionaire's Tax, and the voters will have the choice after a ballot initiative and the votes of myself during two separate, in 2 different sessions, constitutional conventions to put this so-called Fair Share Amendment on the ballot in November of this year, 2018, to decide whether or not to increase the income tax for those who bring in $1 million in revenue, in income each year. This is not including assets. This is individuals whose income, sole income, is $1 million each year would have an increase of about 4 to 5% on their income tax, and this would generate around $2 billion in revenue each year. And $1 billion of that would be earmarked to education. The other $1 billion would be earmarked towards transportation. So that would be not a solution, but an opportunity to invest in public transportation. But the meeting I am having with other legislators as the chair of the caucus tomorrow with Luis Ramirez is the part of the MBTA that is looked at as being least satisfactory in terms of the riders. And that's our bus service. I helped conduct a survey with the MBTA on what do riders believe is the best part of the system, and what do riders in the Commonwealth believe is the worst part of the system. And the least satisfaction that riders have is the bus service.
And what aspect or aspects of the bus service?
I think in terms of time management, when the buses come, the bunching of buses that we see, you wait a long time for a bus and then all of a sudden you see 3 bunched up and 2 of them are out of order and 1 is running. The timing, buses making sure they're on schedule, and on time. So these are things that I've been working on to try to improve the satisfaction of the riders. Also because Arlington only has bus service. We also have the ride, but we don't have we have Alewife, we have hopefully the potential Green Line project, but that's outside of our city, or outside of Arlington, our town, but not coming into our town. So, improving that satisfaction is very important. I was proud to lead when there was a proposal a couple of years ago to cut all bus service out of Alewife Station, to stop that, because obviously that would be very detrimental to the riders here in Arlington. But we need to improve that experience. And as someone who rides the bus to Alewife almost every single day to take the train to Park Street, it's something that's important to me, but also to the commuters I talk to on a regular basis on the 77 or the 79.
Yeah, that absolutely accords with my own experience as well, and those of the various people that work at ACMi and others in town. Clearly a reliable, predictable, to the extent that it is possible, and comfortable commute on the bus would be a wonderful thing to be able to take for granted.
Absolutely, and these are some of the things we're going to be talking about with General Manager Ramirez tomorrow. Certainly the other aspect that I've been working on as the chair of the MBTA, I serve on the North-South Rail Link working group, and I was able to secure money in the bond bill several years ago that called for an actual actuarial study, an environmental review study, on how much it would really cost to connect North and South Station to finally have that link, which was originally proposed with the Big Dig decades ago, but was taken out because of fear of costs. But it is absolutely mind-boggling to me that you need to, you can take the train all the way up the eastern seaboard, but you need to stop at South Station and take another transportation over to North Station to continue north. That's inexcusable. That hurts our economy as a Commonwealth. And so I think the North-South Rail Link just makes sense. So that study is ongoing, and hopefully we're going to have the results of that study so we can actually know and give Governor Baker what the actual amount of revenue it would cost to make the North-South Rail Link possible. And obviously we would be arguing and advocating on our federal partners to help with the cost of that if we choose to go that route.
Does a study like that, or that study specifically, in addition to tallying up how much it would cost to do such a thing, does it also attempt to give a sense of what the benefits that would accrue on the other side? What we would be spending that money for, and how well worth it would be? Is that part of the study, or then just simply part of your guys' advocacy on the other side? Sure.
This study is mainly around the cost of the project, because there have been studies on this for decades, and some of the costs say it's $8 billion. Some of the cost says it's $2 billion. So there's been no actual serious focus on how much it would be to do the North-South Rail Link. But obviously there's been other studies on the economic impact and the positiveness of connecting North and South Station around commuter satisfaction, around economic development, around truck transportation. That flow of just being able to go right through Boston is something that I believe really, really is important, and something that has been interesting to people north of us, all the way into other states in New England, also into Canada, and south of us. So this could be certainly an economic boom to our region, but to figure out if it's worth the investment, it's critical to know the cost, the actual cost, not just a guesstimate, but an actual specific cost of how much it would cost to do this project.
Okay. So switching gears, pun intended, away from transportation, Let's another issue that is clearly of importance to many people in the Commonwealth and here in Arlington is criminal justice reform. And we know that there is currently an omnibus bill on that subject that is proceeding. There will be a House version and a Senate version, is that right? And they will then need to be combined. And all of this is in the works as we speak. And just wanted to get your views on what those bills look like to you, and what your own, role going forward as you see it is.
Well, it's a very exciting opportunity, James. This is a topic that I believe progressives and conservatives can agree on. We spend, as a Commonwealth, more money on incarceration than we do on public higher education on one of our 29 campuses in Massachusetts. And wouldn't it be great to invest in opportunity of an individual rather than a punitive punishment on a nonviolent offender who might have made a mistake or who has a history of mental illness that needs to be addressed and treated, not just given a strict punishment. So you are right. Currently, the House version of the bill and the Senate version of the bill are completed, and they're before a conference committee right now. So the Senate deliberated on their bill, and the House deliberated on their bill. I like both bills. I like aspects different of each bill. I think the state Senate did an outstanding job in their bill, and I do like the House of Representatives bill because there are several aspects of the Omnibus Comprehensive Criminal Justice System Reform Bill that are actually my pieces of legislation. One is around restorative justice. Obviously, as you've done interviews with Chief Ryan and other folks on the importance of restorative justice, this would be the first time in Massachusetts history where the word restorative justice would appear in Massachusetts statute. But it's certainly more, the bill is certainly more than just the name. It's a framework and it's enabling legislation, and really the program of restorative justice would be in statute to create that opportunity for low-level offenders, first-time offenders, nonviolent offenders to be able to go to a restorative justice program. And the goal is to try to have this happen in all 351 cities and towns. In my opinion, James, is the cost savings would be tremendous, but also the responsible party, they would be strongly supported by this initiative because they wouldn't have a permanent record on their record, that they would have a future in creating that opportunity. They wouldn't be held back by a punitive punishment and a mistake that was nonviolent that they made in the past. But also the victim's satisfaction with restorative justice is rated as much higher than the criminal justice process. So I'm excited about my bill passing, and it's in conference committee. I've been busy talking with the House and Senate chairs on the different aspect of restorative justice, trying to make sure that the program is done pre-arraignment, but also allowing for post-arraignment as well. But being able to do restorative justice in our cities, in our towns, I think would be hugely beneficial and create, honestly, transformative change to our culture and to our criminal justice system. So I'm very excited about that. Another aspect of the House bill that was a bill that I filed was around early compassionate medical release, and it would really create a program. So currently in the Commonwealth, we're one of the only states in the country, either one of the only state or one of two of the only states in the country that doesn't have a mechanism for when inmates are close to death or when they are suffering from a terminal illness months out. And this is completely inhumane because there's no process to transfer that inmate to a more appropriate medical facility who could treat his or her illness in a more compassionate way. outside of a prison in the Commonwealth. And so my bill, which passed the House omnibus bill and the criminal justice reform, would allow for a process. So you would have a medical release parole board. It would be certainly strict to make sure that the only ones that would be allowed to do this would be those who are at the end of their life. Mm-hmm. But it's humanity is very, very important. And the fact that we were one of the only states that didn't have this program in law was very troubling to me.
Yeah, and that strikes me as one of those things that is a true opportunity for you as a legislator, which is, we all know that people behind bars are not much advocated for, that the vast majority of the population who has little or no contact with such folks just doesn't think about their health and welfare all that much. And then specifically you add onto that the idea of a terminal situation where there's just a short time in which still to live. To have you and other legislators be able to introduce policy and law so as to accord people in that situation dignity, that's the only way that this kind of thing would get done. And I would imagine that there are a lot of legislators who would find other priorities to be, to take precedence over something like that. And this is a real opportunity, as you say, to make humaneness and humanity a centerpiece of policy.
Absolutely, James. And I would also say one of the reasons I believe the legislature took the bill up in a comprehensive way was because of our constituents. There have been thousands of people in Massachusetts calling for comprehensive criminal justice reform. Folks writing to their legislators, meeting with their legislators, demanding real reform around minimum mandatory sentencing, expungement practices, solitary confinement practices, bail reform practices. There have been restorative justice. There have been so many constituents reaching out to me. So I strongly believe that one of the reasons we're here at this point now in history is because of constituents like the hundreds of those in Arlington who care so much about this issue, who got active and made it a point to be at the State House on a daily basis, talk to legislators about why this initiative is so critical for the future and the well-being of so many in our Commonwealth and for our Commonwealth itself. So I really need to give a hats off to all of the advocates and constituents who got involved so much in this issue. So the bill is in conference committee right now. So once it's released, I'm really hoping that it's a very progressive and comprehensive bill that we can send to Governor Baker for his signature. And I'm hoping that will happen in the next few months.
I think we are all looking forward to that.
Yeah. I know you've been doing a lot of work on this issue, James, so I thank you.
Thank you. Sean, we had just been talking about criminal justice reform and the bill that is working its way through the State House, through the legislature as we speak. A component of that you already mentioned and that people are aware of in general is mental health and the intersection so often between police action or police interaction with citizens and crime, et cetera, and incarceration and mental health. I know that this also is a subject that is very near and dear to your heart and about which you have been a very active member of the legislature over these years. Again, same question. What's the update? What's going on in the area of mental health and even health insurance more generally in the legislature as we speak?
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, because the legislature is acting right now, but before we pass this comprehensive criminal justice reform bill, our incarceration system, our prisons, are widely encompassed with those with mental illness. And so I think many of us can agree about the importance of making sure that those who suffer with mental illness get the treatment that they need, and not punitive jail sentences for things that are not violent. And that was one of the core pieces of the criminal justice reform bill, whether it be around bail reform or improving solitary confinement. So the legislation, both pieces, mandate that solitary confinement must not be used on those who are mentally ill. And that's just compassionate to other human beings, and making sure that we properly diagnose and treat those with mental illness. The other aspect of that is when those who live with mental illness, once they leave the prison system, because unfortunately, if you've ever heard the school to prison pipeline and the vicious cycle, which I'm hoping restorative justice will stop in its tracks, that also happens with people with mental illness, because they're not properly diagnosed, but most importantly, they're not properly treated, whether because of lack of mental health services, lack of clubhouse, just lack of services in general. This is absolutely critical. But I would start at the school level. So there is a piece of legislation that I filed around educational psychologists, which actually passed the House before, but unfortunately did not pass the Senate. But it would add educational psychologists, the menu of options for treatment for our kids and other folks with mental illness, to the mental health parity law, so that kids could get treated. One of the serious problems we have is the lack of treatment availability. And that's one thing that this piece of legislation that I filed could address.
Okay.
But also the importance of more beds in the Commonwealth. It's a budgetary issue, but it's also an investment issue for these individuals. And so, it's great to have criminal justice reform. I think that's critical, but we also need to invest in these critical programs.
And some people are concerned that in terms of health insurance more generally, some people are concerned about the fact that, can Massachusetts itself, which provides a wider degree of health coverage than many states do for their populations, can we remain insulated from the storms emanating out of Washington, D.C. around health insurance specifically and any number of other issues? So asking you, first of all, to address health insurance specifically, if there is any news to report on that matter. And then secondly, to just tell us a little bit about how it feels inside of the State House these days, given, again, what can be an antagonistic, if not relationship, then certainly set of priorities between our state legislature and the federal government.
Right, absolutely, James. Well, Chapter 58, when it was passed, also known as Romney Care, provided unprecedented coverage that had ever been done before across the country. The Affordable Care Act increased that coverage fourfold, certainly more than what Chapter 58 covered. So the concern of the removal of the mandate, the concern of what's happening in Washington certainly concerns us in terms of making sure that we continue to deliver quality and affordable health care to families and individuals in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I know that concern is felt by voters and families across the Commonwealth, but also legislators. And so I'm hoping next month or the month after, so either in March or April, we in the House of Representatives will be taking up an omnibus health care bill. What will be in there for details is still being worked out, but one of my hopes that will be in there is a question around whether we want to move Massachusetts to a single payer system to address the current burdens and the current costs of health insurance on families in Massachusetts, and try to take the greed of corporations and health insurance companies out of the health care business, because currently, even though we have terrific coverage, we're still a sick care system, and that is you don't get cared for until you get sick. And I think that needs to change. That's a cultural change to our healthcare system. So I'm hoping that that will be one of the aspects that we will talk about, but also a provision that did pass the Senate during their health and care debate is one that I hope will pass the House when we debate it within the next couple of months, and that is that there be a cost analysis done on the current system that weighs the coverage, quality of care, and the cost, but also around if we did move to a single payer system, how much would we save? Would it be more expensive to move to a single payer system, or is it more cost effective to switch, to have those facts before policymakers? And if it is, that we start to transition.
So do I hear you then saying that the idea of single payer system, of a single payer system, may be in and of itself a long way from actually becoming reality, but one step towards that, which is much more possible as you see it, is that data is generated to be able to compare the relative costs and benefits of the two systems, the existing system and a single payer system, as a step towards perhaps that becoming a reality.
I think that's absolutely correct. So even though I support single payer, I spend most of my days at the State House in conversations with other members and trying to build collaboration, build a partnership in terms of what we can agree and disagree on, and help to move actual policy forward. And so this piece that did pass the state Senate's health insurance bill, or hopefully will pass our health care bill, is around the cost and the measurement of that cost, and if single payer would be cheaper, more cost effective, then we can transition into that process. So I think the answer to that is I think single payer is a ways off in the State House, but that's why being a legislator is such an incredible opportunity and such important work, because there's 200 of us, and it does take conversation, building alliances, and being able to build agreement around certain subject matters, whether it be around people with disabilities, renewable energy, education, certainly healthcare.
Now, you were just mentioning a basket full of different issues there, and that reminds me that before we end our conversation, I wanted to invite you to just briefly describe any legislation that you're sponsoring or particularly interested in that we haven't yet covered today.
Yep. Well, a lot of the pieces of legislation I filed is to answer your question earlier around the dynamics between a Trump administration and how it's impacting the Commonwealth. So some of those bills that I have filed was around the children's health insurance program, that if the Republicans in Washington cut funding for millions and millions of kids around this country who demand and need that health insurance coverage, that kids in Massachusetts would receive that continuity of care regardless what Washington would do. So that's one piece of legislation I filed with about 60 of my colleagues, by the way. Another piece is around the importance of investing in renewable energy and working to try to get Massachusetts a roadmap to transition to 100% renewable energy. And that is a direct response, even though I filed it before the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Accords. But we have tremendous support among the legislature and the advocate community around passing that legislation, because we know the issue of climate change is not going to be the priority of this administration at the federal level. So that is why Massachusetts really needs to be on the roadmap to transition to 100% renewable energy and to talk about global warming. And the other important aspect really is around, in terms of dealing with the Trump administration, is making sure that Massachusetts is a welcomed place for immigrants here in Arlington, immigrants across the Commonwealth, and trying to pass what is known the Safe Communities Act. And that is something that I strongly support. It is not weak on crime. There's a lot of miscommunication in terms of what it is, but more importantly, what it's not. It is not a chance for undocumented immigrants to commit crimes. Actually, as you know, James, there's no evidence that suggests that undocumented immigrants commit more crimes than documented immigrants or regular general citizens. And so this legislation, it's very basic and clear to make sure that we don't have law enforcement with taxpayer dollars just randomly going up to people on the street and asking their citizenship. That is not what taxpayer money here in Arlington and Massachusetts should be used to do. But if an undocumented immigrant commits a crime, they would not be protected by this legislation. So that's not what this, the opposite side, if you will, has done a very good job in terms of not describing this bill accurately and really causing the worst demons to come out on this issue, which is very unfortunate. But you asked the question earlier about the Trump administration. So these are some of the issues that I've been working on around that issue. Some of the issues that I'm very proud to work on that just were released by committee because of the Joint 10 deadline are a number of pieces of legislation. The Joint Committee on Financial Services released a bill favorably that I filed around mandated insurance coverage for those living with multiple sclerosis. Those who live with MS every single day know that when insurance companies cover a prescription drug that heals their flare-up, that an insurance company can drop them from their insurance without written notice, without warning. And because of that, that can create serious amounts of pain, both physical and emotional, especially if they try to shop around for another medication that may work to stop their flare-ups. This bill would mandate that insurance coverage, that continuity of care as patients switch from drugs to drug to find that drug that will work for them. And that's important for them in a humane way, but also for the taxpayer. Because if there is a flare-up, they have no choice but to go to an emergency room if there's not coverage. So I think most people can agree that that's critical. Another piece that the Financial Services Committee just released that's very important to me is around a mandated benefit bill that I filed is around children who suffer from what's known as eosinophilic esophagitis. It's a protein disorder where kids literally can't eat food like we can and need to take medical food that the insurance companies have deemed not instrumental or not critical or not medical food, and I humbly disagree. So that has passed committee because I think that's absolutely critical. Another bill that the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development just passed of mine is around workmen's compensation, around disfigurement and scarring compensation. So currently in Massachusetts, if you're a worker and through no fault of your own, you injure yourself on the job, and let's say you get burned seriously on your legs, your torso, your shoulders, your arms, and obviously it creates discomfort and your inability to get back to work. Remember, this is through no fault of your own. You would receive 0 under Mass General Law in workman's compensation. You only receive workman's compensation around disfigurement and scarring if the scarring takes place on your hands, neck, or face. Completely unfair. So my bill would remove that prohibition on your hands, neck, or face and say, if you get burned on your torso, just because you can cover it up doesn't mean it's not a harmful situation for you, and that should be covered. Another piece of legislation that just passed the Joint Committee on Higher Education, which I proudly serve as the vice chair, is really around a civil rights piece, which would allow students who live with severe disabilities and around the spectrum of autism and Down syndrome to be able to go to college, one of our 29 campuses of higher learning, even if they don't pass the MCAS test. And the reason for that is around measuring of outcomes, because students who live with Down syndrome and autism every single day do better if they have more education in terms of responsibilities and employment and self-sufficiency. So to me, this is certainly one of my most important pieces of legislation this session because it's around civil rights. Kids who live with Down syndrome and autism should have a right to go to college if they and their families and their IEP team believe it's the right direction for them. I have had several other pieces of legislation pass committee, but I know we're almost out of time. But anyone who wants to go to my website can view the amount of pieces of legislation that I have filed that have continued to pass this session. But also they can call me. My cell phone number is 781-859-7781, or they can call my office at 617-722-2090. So one of the honors of my life is serving the people of Arlington and Medford. And many constituents call me on my cell phone on a regular basis or call my office to talk to my legislative staff. And I welcome that. I think that's an absolute critical part of being a legislator.
I imagine, and this is going to be the last thing we get to talk about today, that you also welcome something else, and that is you and I have talked over the years about the importance of you and other sitting legislators being challenged by others so as to be able to keep that public conversation going and make sure we're holding your guys' feet to the fire, et cetera. And it has been rare in your time so far that you've been contested, and I believe that you have a primary opponent perhaps for the first time in your legislative career. So I just wanted to ask you briefly, I assume that you welcome this development.
I really do, and I do because most people in Massachusetts choose not to run for office, and I think it is absolutely critical. It's a critical part of making sure we live in a functioning democracy that people who want to run for office do, and that more people run for office, more people get engaged in seeing the problems that they see on their streets, in their communities, in our Commonwealth, and say, I want to run for office because I believe I have the skill set to address those concerns. And so I encourage people to run for office. I don't believe any incumbent should ever run unopposed. I certainly haven't welcomed that, but I certainly welcome to have my record on full examination for the people of Arlington and West Medford and for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I would like to think that one of the reasons I don't have an opponent every year is because people think I'm doing a good job. But certainly, we don't own these seats. These legislative seats are the people seats of Arlington and West Medford and other seats across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They belong to the people, not an individual representative. This is not a permanent employment. This is a great opportunity that we're given by the voters to serve them and their families. I don't take it lightly. I'm looking forward to having this conversation. I'm looking forward to returning next January and being able to continue to fight for the people of Arlington and Medford in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So thanks for having me, James.
Appreciate your being here, and you're right, you don't own the seat that you hold in the legislature. I will say you've got a long-term lease on the seat you're in right now. We will always welcome you back to conversations here.
Thank you.
And we look forward to the next one, and we wish you best of luck with the busy months to come.
Great. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
For Representative Sean Garballey, I am James Milan. You've been watching Talk of the Town. We appreciate your being here. We'll see you next time.